Well, good afternoon, gentlemen. It's good to see you again. 1 week later, and the war in Iran continues to cause chaos in energy markets. Since we last spoke, the oil price is up an additional 10%, Australian dollars weaker, and we've endured 4 weeks of declining share markets. But today, John, the share market added 50 points. Do you get the sense that the market is now coming to terms with the long-term consequences of this oil shock? And perhaps you can also refer to commodity prices and bond prices in your reply.
I think we shouldn't read too much into the share market on the last day of a quarter. Markets get manipulated by big fund managers, and I think today was another manipulation day. But we were helped by Donald Trump tweeting that he would leave Iran at a moment's notice and leave the Strait blocked. Quite an amazing statement, but I suspect he's looking at the market for the end of March as well in America, so that's a bit of a relief for them. The market's down 7% in March. It's barely up financial year to date if you add back dividends. We are in correction mode. I don't read too much into today's performance. I think we are come a lot of downgrades in earnings. The longer this war goes on, the longer the oil price stays where it is. The cost of doing business, as I said last week, and I want to reiterate, I'd say the cost of most businesses is up by 10%. Those who are highly reliant on moving goods around. If that's not recovered in price rises, there is profit downgrades coming right across the market in industrials. Resources, as you commented, probably okay, and the recent drop in the Aussie dollar is good news for BHP and Rio because commodity prices really are holding. And I think we've had the correction in gold, but don't shoot me if I'm wrong. I think gold's probably going to start rallying for a very simple reason. The American deficit, when we get back to looking at the balance sheet of the American government, it's in an appalling state. And we're probably looking at quantitative easing the second half of this year, which is going to put pressure on the US dollar and upward pressure on gold.
Yeah, it's interesting that during the course of the war, the gold price has actually fallen by 15%. So perhaps it was front running, the war. Michael, to you now, clearly the government is very intent on getting on the front foot with the energy crisis. They've reconvened the national cabinet, similar to what happened during COVID. They've articulated a 4-point plan. Perhaps you can comment about that 4-point plan or the government's decision more specifically to halve the oil excise rate for a period of 3 months. So 26 cents comes off the price of petrol. Is that an appropriate response? What do you think is going on there?
I think, to be brutally honest, it's a little bit of a disingenuous response because it's really just going to help consumers and do nothing for industry that still have the same cost. Primary industry agriculture receives a tax credit or a rebate on the fuel tax. So the fuel price that's come through will still be the same impact on those businesses with or without an excise relief. The excise relief is a political stunt, effectively, that is a way to respond to consumer concerns more so than to address any root cause or issue, is probably my blunt assessment. And the other 3 points are words. If you look at what needs to be done, it would have been to act earlier with any plans for, not controls on pricing, but controls on rations. That would have been better to have been done early, knowing the impact, knowing the long-term impact. And then to look at other things which have been floated and discussed, like discounting public transport to encourage increased use. And that's one of those things where we're already paying the public transport infrastructure is a sunk cost. We could be getting better utility out of it. We could do that by improving access to it, by lowering its cost. And we don't have to give things away either. People are responsive to the idea of, we'd like to provide this for a lower cost, we'll charge over here. So I think it's a late, ineffective, frustrating is probably the best way to put it.
One of the big impacts of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz is that we haven't been getting the fertilizer that we import from that region. I think we import something like 65% of our fertilizer from there, largely urea. This is going to feed into food prices. The market hasn't seemingly focused on this. What do you think about that?
I think the market won't be impacted so much as the person's hip pocket is, because the market has the ability to pass on pricing on foodstuffs and other goods, and most of those are staples. So, are Woolworths going to see a reduction in their margins from increased fruit and vegetable costs? Probably not. Because Woolworths and Coles margins are, despite their large volume, their margins are actually razor thin. So they're unlikely to absorb the increased cost of apples, fruits, nuts, and other agriculture. It is actually a really serious problem. It's probably a bigger problem than the fuel, actually, if I'm honest, because and it is being talked about amongst agricultural circles, but we really don't keep much of a reserve for fertiliser. Our soils in Australia are very anemic when it comes to natural nutrients and the ability to grow. They need to be treated to grow. Urea, for those interested, is basically a process to create. So urea is, for want of a better term, animal urine, right? But the way we actually produce it at scale is we use natural gas combined with ammonia to both fuel and create urea. And we don't do that in Australia, despite having some of the world's largest natural gas reserves. So again, it's one of these things where we really haven't looked at our own sovereign capability and what we need versus what we actually import. We've just relied on the idea of perpetually being able to import things. And this one does catch us out. Quite a few, I think as much as 20% of agricultural producers have less than a week's worth of fertiliser reserves. Some of them, I think the average is about 3 weeks. There's no easy solution to this problem as well. So what that means is a lot of our growers will probably have to delay plantings.
Wow.
So that can have some pretty big flow-on effects. And considering that Australia has probably the highest OECD inflation rate at the moment, this is certainly going to keep the pedal down on the cost increases of regular living. And, CPI is a basket of goods, and the majority of those basket of goods are agricultural produce, which we also export. If I go on a little bit of a rant here for a second, the big problem we find ourselves with is that we export a lot of food. Australia is able to produce 5 times more than we need to consume as a nation. So we're a massive exporter of agricultural process. Anyone knows their Australian history knows that we created a country on the sheep's back, right? So the challenge with having our own exports potentially displaced or disturbed by a lack of fertiliser is that our export partners will no longer find us to be reliable. And there are other markets that our export partners can go to buy our produce. They might not be as good a quality. In fact, I guarantee it's not. Our produce is fantastic, but market partners want certainty of supply. So the real risk right now is that if we don't have certainty of fertiliser, we run the risk of delaying plantings, delaying produce, increasing costs for food here, reducing our export capability, which then leads our partners to go elsewhere.
Thank you, Michael. John, Michael referenced inflationary pressures. Overnight, Jay Powell of the Federal Reserve said that the Fed is very much on course to watch and wait and see rather than act straight away. And, he's going to be replaced by Kevin Walsh in May, so probably he wants to go out without raising rates or being forced to cut them. But the RBA seems to be in quite a different position. Inflation here looks like it's going to peak closer to 6% in the June month rather than 5%. And I noticed that Westpac's now forecasting 3 rate increases. Do you think that's credible? What are your thoughts on how the RBA responds to this inflationary spike?
Well, if the economy slows and the consumer is pulling back in the next 3 months to 6 months because of petrol prices, and then the general cost of the standard cost of living going up, the Reserve Bank doesn't need to put up interest rates because the economy is going to slow under its own weight. There's history here. The central banks in the past have looked at inflation surges as particularly coming out of COVID and then the Ukraine war as transitory. So, I think I would be going on to transitory. This inflation will jump pretty quickly, then it'll stabilise. And the question about putting interest rates up should be delayed 6 months to see whether inflation's coming back again on a trajectory which is explainable. But jumping in now, putting up interest rates would be, I think it was dumb doing it 2 weeks ago to be dumb to forecast it's going to happen in the next 3 months, I think. It's a difficult situation. It needs coordination of economic policy between Canberra, the Treasury, and monetary policy. But I keep on saying I don't see any coordination. I'm a little bit different to Michael. I think cutting the cost of petrol is a reasonable thing to do, but I also think free transport would be a reasonable thing to do. When economies go down into a slowdown, the natural thing for the budget, the natural reaction of a budget, even if you don't touch it, is to go into deficit, to stimulate. All the government is proposing now is to increase that stimulation against a very strong headwind of higher prices and consumers pulling back. But it needs to be talking to the Reserve Bank and get a coordinated policy. And finally, we're going to get a wage increase. We had a wage increase today for 18-year-olds, which is an interesting issue, and that'll hit the retailers, that'll hit some of the fast food chains. Is it good for young workers or those with experience? Yes. Those without experience, no. But, we really should be adjusting the low-income tax rates and trying to hold down wage increases so we get through this period. I feel like a drumbeat alone here. There's no coordination. We need to attack inflation through fiscal policy and not push it up through wages policy.
And I think just to jump on that, Paul, John's 100% right, and I'm just going to repeat it. The easiest way to provide to increase the amount of money in the pocket of lower income earners is to increase the tax bracket. You increase the minimum wage, which they've been very loud and proud about, just creates a flow-on effect in inflation. Now, there is many benefits to a high minimum wage, so I'm not going to sit there and say there is, we should just not have one. But at the same time, as to how you put more money in people's pockets, right now, with the inflationary effects that we have, the safest, best way to do that is to lift the tax-free threshold from 18,000 up. Should it be 21,000 or 23,000? That is the easiest way to put more money in people's pockets.
It's quite interesting. John mentioned the pressures on the budget, but the federal treasurer is going to get something like, I saw a figure today, a $60 billion boost over the next 5 years because of commodity prices. So the increase in oil, the increase in gold, the fact that iron ore stayed at like 105, 106 when they budgeted for $60 per ton, coal, all these factors are going to give them a hell of a lot more money than they planned for over the next 5 years. But I want to finish.
Hold on, there's a windfall also on gold. Gold is holding around 4,500. It was 5,000. The budget's talking about $4,000, so it's underestimated there as well. So you're right, and what the Treasurer can do is juggle the excess revenue and give it back, as opposed to what he says, I'm banking it. There's no point banking it. Give it back in tax relief against the indexation, which Michael talks about. We've got to stop just whacking up taxes just because you get a higher salary willy-nilly. It's quite unfair. There should be some adjustment for inflation.
Yeah. This question, I'd like you both to respond to. In the last few weeks, we've commented about a swing to populism in Australian politics and really throughout the Western world. We spoke about the South Australian, election and the rise of One Nation. This morning, ANZ and Roy Morgan released a consumer confidence survey. This survey has been running for more than 50 years. The result today is the lowest they've ever achieved since monitoring the surveys since 1972. So it's a diffusion index which asks, if they phone 1,000 people and they ask, are you feeling better or worse about your economic circumstances? Do you think that Australia's economy will be better or worse in the next 12 months? Are you more prepared or less prepared to spend on a big ticket item? Those sorts of questions. We've come in for the first time in this diffusion index below 60. What is I reckon people are very angry out there. What is both of your responses to this issue of this collapse in consumer sentiment?
I'll let Michael answer first and what I think about it, but it's interesting that the period you just mentioned includes two recessions, early 80s and early 90s. So we have consumer attitudes lower than they were during recessions. And I think it's been clear in Australia we've had a income recession, a productivity recession, and now we're getting a consumer recession. So I'll leave it to you, Michael.
Yeah, the funny thing, the first thing that came to my thought was the stagflation period of the 70s, actually, where you had rising inflation and no growth. Look, I think we've talked about it a lot here that, the family has been in a recession for the last 2 years. Real earnings are now lower than they were before COVID for most families. Interest rate rises have squeezed the heck out of middle Australia, and then they've seen these immediate pricing shocks. So I don't know that anyone would be surprised from hearing those results. To say that they're the worst since 1972, I believe it because there's a lot of froth on our economy, but the meat and two veg, if you like, the family at the core is getting squeezed. So it's a very discombobulated world right now. Markets are doing okay because, as we've talked about before, money continues to flow to markets. Unemployment is low. It looks okay. The reality of that is that we've put on more public servants than we ever have, and the rate of growth of that public service employment is continuing and maintaining low unemployment. So I think what we've done is we've cheated on the test, is probably the best way to put it. So like in the education circles, you have NAPLAN, right, where you have a score for every student in school. And do you teach the test or do you teach the student, right? I kind of feel like with a lot of our economic factors, we've engineered it so it all looks good, but none of it feels good. And consumers are wise to that.
John, did you want to add to that, or should we end it there?
Look, I think to Michael's point, when you immigrate 1 million people, you only get some funny results. So the economy's been growing, but not matching inflation. And to some extent, the Australian situation is not much different to Europe and USA. And when I look at the USA today, for instance, their economy, adding back inflation, will probably grow 5 or 6% gross, but so will their deficit. So for every dollar the government's spending, overspending, it's just it's matching the growth of the economy. I think Australia's going to go through a similar period. We may well have a forecast deficit because of this downturn, 1.5% to 2%, and that'll be about the growth of the economy. Probably understanding it when I add inflation. All our growth will be inflation this year. So the economy is growing, money growth's growing, and money's flowing around the economy, but I think real consumption and also real investment is dwindling. And there's plenty of evidence to say that particularly the industrial sector, the resources sector has always been a big investor over the last 10 or 20 years, meeting international markets. But the industrial sector, which has to meet the local market, there's not a lot of investment going in. I think we've overinvested in property, residential, and I think we're overinvesting in some aspects of commercial. So we've got to be careful there. There's a real workout we're entering for Australia. And then when you have a workout, you need to have leadership which actually understands you're in a workout, because otherwise the workout will carry the government along. And as Michael said right up front, you'll get reactive policy, not proactive policy. So let's be honest. It's a tough period coming up, slow growth, wages are behind inflation. We're probably going to get a tickle up in unemployment. We've still got the AI issue coming straight at us. It really needs some thought around how Australia is going to push against these headwinds. And, I don't want to be downbeat. I think Australia is a great opportunity, particularly in the Asian region. I say it every week, but, we need to get some focus here on what Australia could be, not where it's going to end up.
Yeah, and I think just in closing on that point, Paul, there's two economies here. The family's getting crushed, but there's so much business opportunity, right? There's so many transactions, so many industrial opportunities, so many large-scale investments in industry and capacity and technology and productivity that we see every day. So despite and this is why sometimes with investing you can't get too caught up on the macro. You need to pay attention to it, but you're ultimately looking for the deals in front of you, because there's more opportunity that comes out of these situations than anything else. So on one hand, you have to be really wise to the investment opportunities that come up. You know, a high inflationary area means there are lots of sectors that can pass costs on quite effectively. But on the family side, which is what we're primarily talking to here, yeah, it's a challenge. What we're seeing is populist reactions rather than careful planning and stewardship.
Well, I think we will leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Another very interesting discussion, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone.
All right.